This week's articles all relate to polarization and how social media affects polarization. But I think the way we have to start is we have to start by defining polarization. And there are essentially two types of polarization. There's first, ideological polarization. Okay? I'll explain what that means in a second, but that has to be divided into two groups: actual ideological polarization and perceived ideological polarization. Actual ideological polarization is when parties are extremely liberal or extremely conservative. Perceived ideological polarization is when you think the parties are. The other type of polarization is affective polarization. Affective polarization is when you like people from your party and you dislike people from the other party. Both of these have increased in recent years. Ideological polarization has certainly increased at the elite level, and perceived ideological polarization has increased at the citizen level. Affective polarization has also increased in recent years too, but we'll look a little bit later on at just how much it has increased. Let's go over what ideological polarization is again, and let's start with a unidimensional scale here that goes from very liberal to very conservative. And let's imagine we have two parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. Democrats represented by the donkey, Republicans represented by the elephant, and this is the convention of the day. Okay? If you have the two parties and they're sort of near the center, as in the current placement in the graph, well, that's not polarized. What's polarized is when the parties, one or the other or both, especially when it's both, move to the more extreme liberal and conservative ends. We see this in Congress. Okay? There aren't as many moderate Democrats and moderate Republicans as there used to be. The Democrats are all liberal, some very liberal. The Republicans are all conservative, some very conservative. One of the reasons for this is because state legislators, those people who you might think might want to run for Congress, the more moderate ones believe that they actually would be seen as, they'd be very isolated in Congress. They'd have no real power because the more liberal leadership on the Democratic side, the more conservative leadership on the Republican side would be skeptical of them always. And so they say they see no reason to run for Congress. And so that's one of the reasons that the parties have become polarized. Okay? So at the elite level, there's clear ideological polarization. It's less clear at the citizen level whether or not there's ideological polarization, but there's certainly perceived ideological polarization. Okay, and it comes from this form. Let's imagine that this is actually where the parties are, and let's imagine that we have some Democrat, and that Democrat, we ask them to place the Democrats. Well, they might place the Democrats where they actually are, but with the Republicans, they're certainly going to place at a more conservative position. The interesting thing, actually, is that for Republicans, if we just had some Republican, the most strongest Republicans, and certainly the most conservative Republicans, will place both parties at their extremes. Right? With the Democrats, they tend to only push the conservatives out towards the extreme, because extreme is usually seen as being bad. Currently with the Republicans, while they see being extremely liberal as being bad, conservative Republicans have no problem with their party being seen as extremely conservative, because they don't think of it necessarily as bad. Okay, so there is clearly social networks effects leading to more perceived ideological polarization, belief that the parties are further apart than they are. Okay, and actually we could think of it two ways, right? One is how far apart the parties are at the national level, and they are fairly far apart, but sort of what the citizens' opinions are, the members of the Democratic Party, members of the Republican Party, those things are actually not as far apart as we might think, but people in some cases see them as very far apart, as some of the articles point to. Now, the other type of polarization is affective polarization. Affective polarization is from the psychological term affect, meaning sort of the emotions that you have. And it really boils down to liking your party and disliking the other party. So one way of measuring whether or not someone is affectively polarized is by asking them this question. How would you feel if your child married a Democrat? And then you ask them, how would you feel if your child married a Republican? Okay, we sometimes add in, and this person will rarely talk about politics, so that what you're really getting at is the unconditional emotional response to a Democrat or to a Republican, as opposed to just I don't want to talk about politics with somebody, especially if I disagree with them. Okay? And so what you're getting at here is if someone in your family was in that party, and they're not somebody who, because of biology, you're supposed to love, how would you feel about this? Right? So what we do is we take the people and divide them into three categories. For each question, they say they are happy, unhappy, or neither happy nor unhappy. And then we say for your in party, that is if you're a Democrat, how you answered the question about your child marrying a Democrat, and if you're a Republican, how you answered the question about marrying a Republican. We say, well, how happy or neither unhappy are you? And then we do the same thing for the out party. And then if you say you are happy with the in party and unhappy with the out party, then you're in that category where we say you are polarized. And in 2016, we did a survey, and this is what you find. We've done it at different times. This is what you typically find. And you find that about 18% of all respondents are polarized. Okay. Now that's some studies have found a little bit higher, but usually they leave out they change the questions a little bit, and that causes a problem. But then also at the same time, the other thing to note is this is higher than it used to be. Okay, it used to be 10%, so 17% is not 17.6%, not a small number. You will notice, however, right, that most people put that they are neither happy nor unhappy, right? That the party of the person their child is marrying is not the most important thing to them. That there are other things that they would care about. We should note that if you ask people, like Yankees fans, how happy they would be with somebody marrying a Red Sox fan, you actually get very similar results to the Democrat-Republican divide. So what we'd say is most people are not polarized. In fact, most are effectively polarized. In fact, most people don't care about politics, don't rate that as the #1 reason for supporting somebody. But there are groups, there's a way you can see this where there's a group that is actually fairly polarized. Okay, and that's strong partisans. When we look at strong partisans, 35% are polarized. That's about the same as those who say they'd be neither happy nor unhappy. It's everybody else, right, where these people are not polarized. It's only 7% will be happy and unhappy, and again, 72% are neither happy in either case. They don't care about politics that much. They don't rate politics as a reason to like or dislike a potential in-law. Okay, about 1/3 of the public is a strong partisans, and 2/3 is everyone else. So a third of a third are very polarized, while a small group of 2/3 is polarized. So you get some polarization, affective polarization, but not a crazy amount. Okay, but social networks affect the amount of polarization. Homogeneous social networks can increase polarization, and there's two ways that this can happen. One is a communications mechanism, okay, that you're shielding information that is good about the out party, and you shield bad information about the in party, right? So if I'm a Democrat surrounded by Democrats, I only hear good news about the Democrats, and only hear bad news about the Republicans. And in this way, social networks affect perceived ideological polarization and affective polarization. It could face actual ideological polarization as well, affect actual ideological polarization as well, but that's a little bit harder to prove. Now, the other mechanism, if you remember Professor Jamie Settle, she wrote the book Frenemies, and you're reading a chapter from it today. Well, she has another theory about how social networks polarize people, particularly Facebook, and it's based on social identity theory. And what social identity theory is, it's a psychological theory. Well, a social identity is essentially a sense of who you are based on the different groups you belong to, right? So if you consider yourself a Democrat, if that's part of who you are, or a Republican, if that's part of who you are, that's one of your social identities. And so, well, actually, it would be nice if I could just have Professor Settle, if I could just have Jamie explain it. Luckily, when we spoke, I asked her the question, how does social media polarize Americans? The subtitle of your book is How Social Media Polarizes America. And you wrote several hundred pages. In less than that, how does social media polarize America?
Social media polarizes America if you think about how it changes our attitudes towards each other. And so the real mechanisms going here are entirely psychological. I don't think social media is necessarily making people's political opinions more extreme. So if you're looking to see whether people are becoming, more extreme liberals and more extreme conservatives, I'm not convinced you'll find that sort of evidence. But if you're looking for how our attitudes about our fellow citizens have changed, I think social media is a really good target. So why is that? It's because sites like Facebook are real live laboratories where phenomena that we've studied for a really long time actually happen in the real world. So the one I'm interested in, it's a theory called social identity theory. And it talks about the way when a group begins to recognize itself as a group and identify people who are not in that group, who are in the out group per se. It starts this whole series of processes that make people have stronger positive feelings for their in-group and much more negative feelings for their out-group, even on things that don't matter at all for how the groups were defined originally. And social media, especially Facebook, is really good at that. So I show in the book that people are able to recognize others' political identities. They're able to say this person is a Republican or this person is a Democrat just based on a single piece of content that they post, maybe even content that has nothing to do with politics. So an example of that would be someone posts a picture. They've driven their Prius to the farmer's market and they're posting about how excited they are about all of the organic produce that they just bought. That has nothing to do with politics, but most people are going to guess that the person who posts that is a liberal or is a Democrat. Another example, someone over the weekend went to a country music concert and they post a picture of that, right? Country music is not necessarily political, but we know from some sort of forces, that expand beyond social media, that country music and Republican tend to go hand in hand with one another. So social media is really good for signaling political identity, for helping us figure out other people's political identities. And what comes from that looks just like these classic studies of social identity theory. We're not able to tell the difference between members of our outgroup. We think that they're all the same to each other. We assume that they're all extremists. So we don't recognize that there's diversity within the group and that some people may be more similar to us, some people may be more different. We think everyone's different. So for political groups, this means we tend to think that our political opponents are all at the far end of the ideological spectrum. And then it also goes even further than that. We tend to think that they know less about politics, that they're not using reliable sources, that they're just not as good of people as we are, essentially. And so social media is not designed to do this, but the features that make social media what it is actually have all of these unintended consequences that will allow us to learn more and categorize people and judge people in ways that we wouldn't without social media.
So again, thanks to Jamie Settle, Associate Professor of Government at the College of William and Mary. In conclusion, right, there is this concern about this divide between Democrats and Republicans, an ideological divide and an emotional divide, and there's good reason to be concerned. And what you should take away is that social networks is one potential reason why this divide has been increasing. It's not the only one, but it's the only one that matters from this course. You guessed that from the course's title.